Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I want to explore the area of philosophy which is called epistemology and its relevance to thinking about divination or thinking about tarot. So I've come up with some epistemological questions that relate to tarot, and I'll put them below. I'm not presenting them as a tag or, suggesting that other folks answer them in any definitive way, though I think they're good topics to have conversations about. But I share them just as interesting things to think about, important things to think about. And I think that these are questions that, many of us who read tarot or who divine in one way or another have thought about. And a lot of these are conversations that have come up in the tarot YouTube sphere at one time or another. And, they're the kinds of questions I think that many of us think about, whether we're familiar with epistemology as an area of philosophy or not. But I think that thinking about them in epistemic terms is useful, for me at least, because often I find that these kinds of questions, in conversations that we have about particular issues related to divination or related to tarot, I hear as kind of divination inflected versions of bigger epistemological questions. So thinking about them in that framing for me is helpful and interesting, so I hope it will be interesting for other folks as well. This will inevitably be a ramble. I ramble. But I would like to start by talking a little bit about what exactly epistemology is, and then I'll go through these questions that I've come up with that are epistemological questions that relate to tarot or perhaps divination more broadly. So epistemology is an area of philosophy that deals with questions related to knowledge. So epistemology is concerned with the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, what we can have knowledge about, and what are the kind of limitations on knowledge, what kind of knowledge is possible, what are the sources of knowledge, and how do we kind of verify or validate sources of knowledge. So thinking about things like the senses as sources of knowledge about the world, but also thinking about things like the ways that we gain knowledge from other people or from reading books. Social epistemology is an area that looks at those kinds of questions in terms of gaining knowledge in a social way. Epistemology is interested in how we demarcate knowledge as something different from, for example, opinion or analysis or perspective, and what it means to describe something as knowledge or to claim knowledge about something. What exactly is that claim doing, and what does that mean? And so I think that there are a lot of questions that one could ask about tarot that fall into the realm of epistemology. There are epistemological questions, and that connect to epistemological conversations, philosophical conversations and debates that are kind of more general, but very much about similar things. So I've come up with a few questions to think about. These questions are very much informed by the fact that I predominantly divine for myself. I think that probably if someone is predominantly a professional reader, they might come up with some different questions as well. If that's you, please do leave your epistemological questions below, because I'd be keen to see what other folks think of. But the questions that I've thought of so far, the first question is, are knowing about tarot and knowing how to read tarot different things, different kinds of knowledge? And if so, what is their relationship? And I feel like this is a conversation that has come up and played out a couple of times in different ways, and always kind of comes back to questions about the value of book learning when it comes to something like tarot, or the idea of reading in a way that is described as intuitively, in a way that implies that you don't necessarily need to read a lot of books or study a lot of tarot, but you can learn to read tarot intuitively by doing and by honing your intuition, right? And it's a kind of question, I think, that asks, can you know a lot about tarot without knowing how to read tarot? And can you know how to read tarot without knowing a lot about tarot in a kind of factual or book learning sense, right? And this relates to a broader epistemological conversation very clearly, in that a philosopher called Gilbert Ryle made this distinction between knowing that and knowing how. And in a very brief, he makes the argument that knowing that, like knowing facts about something, is different than knowing how to do something, right? You could think about an example like riding a bike, right? You could read a book about how to ride a bike, but would we then say that you know how to ride a bike because you've read a book that explains how to ride a bike, right? Or is there something else that has to happen that he calls, knowing how, that, for example, involves experiential learning and practicing and probably falling off a bike a few times and figuring out what it feels like to ride a bike, that cannot be attained by reading books about bicycles, right? Are these things different? And this distinction that Ryle makes has been widely critiqued. It's been picked apart. The criticisms of it have been refined, over the now several decades since this idea was introduced. But I think that, the relevance to tarot is pretty clear, right? When we talk about learning how to read tarot, what kinds of learning are we talking about? And what kinds of learning do we, as individuals who are learning to read tarot, perhaps we think of ourselves as perpetual students, I know I do, or think of ourselves as experts, or think of ourselves as having learned to read tarot, or as learning to read tarot. What kinds of things are we actually talking about when we talk about that? What kinds of knowledge are we prioritizing? And in that sense, we could ask the question, a more specific question, what does it mean to say that you know what a card means? If I say that I know what the Fool card means, or if I say that I know what the Fool card in the Smith-Waite tarot deck means, what kind of a claim is that? Right? What am I actually saying that I know? Am I saying that I have spent an immense amount of time with that card and come to a personal understanding that I feel solid in? Am I saying that I've spent time studying various people's interpretations of that card, and learning them, and I'm able to communicate about them and share them with you in conversation? And how does one come to be considered to have expertise in tarot, right? Or to be an expert in tarot, which speaks to knowledge, right? Which speaks to knowledge and speaks to experience. So that's definitely an epistemological question. A related question would be, how is tarot knowledge produced? And this is a question, I think, that for me is about asking, how is it that particular meanings of, say, particular cards come to be seen as the meaning of the card, come to be seen as authoritative, come to be seen as the traditional meaning of a card, right? Are there aspects of that production of tarot knowledge that are established through a kind of consensus through repetition, consensus through citation, as later authors and tarot students and readers and seekers learn from prior ones and then repeat those meanings in perhaps a personally inflected way, but take those meanings on and then also kind of share them forward to new students as well. that is a kind of, the meanings kind of congeal over time through a kind of repetition, and, perhaps interpretations that are far outside of those meanings that become established kind of fall away or are not repeated in the same way, so they don't become considered part of that central meaning. Asking questions about tarot knowledge production in any context, I think, is always a conversation about power relations. And the area of epistemology has not always been good at thinking about this. Much of epistemology historically has tried to think about knowledge in quite an abstract way, and not in actual concrete contexts. And so has approached knowledge in this kind of S knows that P, Laura knows that the pen is on the table kind of a way, that is fairly detached from everyday life. But I think that when we're talking about knowledge production, that approach is kind of wholly inadequate, right? It's completely inadequate, because knowledge production is always bound up with power relations. Thinking about knowledge means thinking about power. And so when we think about that, we can think about, is the production of tarot knowledge occurring in ways that reflect and reproduce even power relations that are unequitable, right? Historically and ongoingly, knowledge production in general here, I'm not speaking specifically about tarot, though it can certainly be included, has happened in spheres that have not been inclusive at all. Right? You think about the sciences, think about the arts, philosophy, these areas of production that have been deeply exclusionary, but have been producing knowledge and claiming, a kind of objectivity in doing so, right? And not doing so in a self-reflexive way about those exclusions, right? And that being a big problem. And so when we're thinking about knowledge production when it comes to tarot, I think that means asking questions about, the role of tarot books and tarot publishing, and asking hard, critical questions about tarot books, tarot publishing, tarot YouTube, tarot conferences, and thinking about how these could be changed in order to ensure that tarot knowledge is being produced in an equitable and inclusive way. And in the late 80s, Lorraine Code, who's a feminist philosopher, she said that, a big question for feminist epistemology specifically is the question of whose knowledge are we talking about? And she's drawing attention to the fact that in so much of epistemology, that question hadn't been asked. Right? That in philosophy departments that are overwhelmingly not very inclusive at all, the question of whose knowledge are we talking about was not being asked, right? As though that question didn't matter, but that question definitely matters. And feminist epistemologists have brought that question to more of the forefront, bringing attention to these kinds of exclusions. And so in the context of tarot knowledge production, we have to ask those questions too, and speak about those questions, and that can have to do with looking at the ways in which, not just when it comes to tarot, but, across the board, there are real issues of exclusion and discrimination and lack of diversity in publishing, full stop. Right? And that this affects, everything from who gets book deals to the size of the advances that people get, authors get, to the amount of promotions that different books get, and, the amount of advertising dollars that different books get. All of these things, which then shape the knowledge that is being disseminated and being taken up the most, right? Similarly, conferences and panels, are panels inclusive, right? These are all knowledge production questions that require looking at sites of knowledge production and also at ourselves and the way in which we confer expertise on, some individuals or publishers or books and so on, and not others, and why that is. So these are crucially important questions. They're political questions, they're social justice questions, and they're also epistemology questions in that they deal with how the status of knowledge or expertise, which is valued, is conferred or not, and how knowledge is circulated. This can also ask questions about accessibility of epistemic goods. So that would be things like making learning opportunities affordable and accessible and welcoming. These are all knowledge production questions that are social justice questions and also epistemology questions. The next question I thought of is, what is the relevance of the concept of neutrality to tarot reading? Is neutrality possible? Is neutrality desirable? And I've talked about this question before. Is it possible to read tarot neutrally? And if so, what does that mean? And if so, would we want to? Why would we want to? Right? And in asking this question, I'm influenced by feminist standpoint epistemology and standpoint thinking, which is a very, very broad kind of eclectic term that's been applied to a number of different authors' work, but that refers to a kind of approach to thinking about knowledge that considers all knowledge to be perspectival, right? And Donna Haraway uses the language of situated, all knowledge being situated in a particular location. This brings attention to the ways in which our social locations, in a broader social structure, our identities, are relevant to how we know about the world in terms of forming part of our perspective on the world, right? And the idea of a standpoint or of perspectival or situated knowledge makes, among other things, the argument that all knowledge is, again, from a perspective, right? We can't know something without, we can't know something from kind of what gets called a God's eye view of the world, because we're always in the world, right? We're always in the thing that we're talking about to one extent or another. Donna Haraway talks about this kind of God trick wherein scientists will kind of talk about their subject or their studies as though they aren't themselves a part of them, right? As though they're doing these kind of explorations in a neutral way. And Haraway argues there's something profoundly unaccountable about this, right? There's no accountability to one's own position and the relevance of one's own position. There's no self-reflexivity about how who you are, is relevant to the knowledge you're producing and to what you're saying, what you're writing, right? And so for me, I find the language of neutrality, when it comes to the idea of reading tarot neutrally, unhelpful, right? I do find the language of neutral helpful when it comes to, describing a particular card as having a very neutral image, as opposed to, say, a very cheerful image or a very sad image. But I don't find the idea of reading tarot neutrally to be particularly useful, because it seems to suggest somehow bracketing off parts of what I know, parts of who I am, things I care about, from the reading process, which for me, in terms of epistemology, I don't believe is possible. There are many who would disagree with me, but I don't think it's possible. And I also don't think that this would be desirable, right? And I think that the idea of self-reflexivity and thinking about one's own positioning in relation to a reading is more helpful for me than pretending that positionality doesn't exist, if that makes sense. there's like only a couple of more questions that I had thought about, and I have them in a document here, so that's why I'm looking off to the side. A related question to the neutrality question would be, what relevant epistemic differences exist between reading for oneself and reading for others? Okay. And what makes me ask this question is that sometimes I know I'm not the only one here. There are times when I have felt that I was too close to something and too, perhaps upset about something, but I wanted to have a reading about it, that I have refrained from reading for myself and paid for a reading from someone else. Right? And that seems to suggest, thinking about my own behavior here, there's some sense that, okay, well, someone else can be objective in a way that I can't here. I care too much about the outcome. So I'm going to get someone else to read for me because they are not as, I don't know, emotionally wrapped up with the question of like, am I going to get this job, or, what's up in my romantic relationships, right? So you ask someone else to read for you. I've totally done this. And at the same time, I have seen some, tarot authors, YouTubers, etc., have conversations or make comments about, the question of like, when can you really read for yourself? When should you read for yourself? When can't you read for yourself? And all of these questions kind of turn to me on a question of what kind of objectivity is possible, and seem to uphold the idea that reading objectively is the desired goal, right? And I've used this language myself, right? I'm not putting this way of thinking down. I have totally had the thought process of, well, I really can't, objectively ask myself the question and do a reading for myself about whether it is time to make a particular change in my life, because I really, really want it to be that time. So I might just, maybe I'll just read into the cards what I want to see. Who knows? And so I'll get a reading from someone else. I'll pay another tarot reader who doesn't know me personally, doesn't know my personal life, to read that for me, right? And sometimes I will think about that in terms of objectivity, but I actually, thinking, more precisely about my language, don't know that that's actually what I mean, because I don't think necessarily that another person can look at me objectively, can look at me or my situation objectively. If objectively means, without any biases, without any preconceived notions, like, I don't think that's possible, right? Anyone who's reading cards for me is doing so from their perspective, with all of their, social location and their identity and how they think about tarot and how they think tarot works and what kinds of questions they think are good tarot questions, and, whether they think tarot can be predictive or not, all of these beliefs, right? And perhaps even biases or prejudices, if we want to think in that direction. If I believe that other readers and myself, like, we can't set those things aside, and I believe that we can't set those things aside, then I don't know that I could say someone else could read for me objectively, though definitely I could say that someone else could read for me in a way that is uninvested or less invested, right? Someone else is not going to, particularly someone who doesn't know me, is not going to be invested in my getting a particular job in the ways that I might be, right? And so maybe there's a difference here in terms of reading for oneself and reading for others when it comes to these kind of questions that are invested in, right? That we are invested in. But I also find that, again, the language of objective is language that I'm questioning the usefulness of, really, because objective can imply the way that we use the word. And in philosophy, things are defined a lot more narrowly and more specifically than they often are in everyday conversation. But we often use the word, objective, much like we use the word, neutral, to suggest that, there's no kind of preconceived notions or biases creeping in, and I don't think that that's accurate. I just don't think that's how knowledge works. So that's an interesting question, I think. I also think that these questions about, when one should or shouldn't read for oneself, whether one can truly read for oneself, in a balanced way, these kind of questions connect to broader questions in epistemology about the knowledge status of introspection and the extent to which we can consider introspection, thinking about our own internal states, as a source of knowledge, and also whether or not introspection is something that we can be wrong about. Right? To what extent can one be wrong about one's own internal state? Right? And it seems to be that one definitely can be wrong about one's internal state, to me anyway. Particularly when we're talking about complex issues, and working through, things that are very emotionally fraught, deep-seated social norms that are internalized. These are things that one can definitely, I think, be not entirely clear on where one is actually at. Other internal states, like, do I have a headache? Yes or no? I mean, I'm going to be accurate about that. And that's also introspection in that it's thinking about an internal state. But these are the kind of questions that I think epistemologists are asking and have been asking for a very long time, that are connected to questions that we think about as tarot readers all the time, right? What's going on when I read for myself? Where is that? Where are the insights that are coming from a reading? And those of us who read for ourselves, I'm sure, have all had these transformative readings that are exactly what we needed. Where some great new insight was gained. That in epistemology is considered to be introspection and considered by many to be a source of knowledge, right? And there's lots of interesting explorations about what that means and what that looks like. The last question that I will mention is an epistemology question related to divination. Is divination, or we'll say tarot readings, accuracy verifiable? If so, how, and does it matter? Can we test the accuracy of the knowledge that we gain from tarot readings, right? And again, does it matter whether we can or not? Because it may not be the purpose of conducting the reading in the first place. And there are lots of epistemological explorations about verification and, when we can consider, how we can test knowledge in all different fields. And it seems to me like the easiest kinds of tarot readings to verify as accurate would be the most straightforwardly predictive ones. Will I get this job that I applied for? Yes or no? I could do a reading about that, and then I either get the job or I don't. You could tell, like, job applications are on my mind right now. I either get the job or I don't, and then I can say, well, does that mean that my tarot reading was right or wrong? And then we end up in conversations that go well beyond epistemology, and we start thinking about things like whether the future is fixed, whether my interpretation of the cards were right or wrong, or whether the apparent rightness or wrongness of the reading actually has more to do with whether or not it's possible to predict things with that much clarity and specificity that far ahead. And a lot of folks, as far as I know, don't do any predictive readings, or are averse to predictive readings. Often I think because of a belief that the future is not completely fixed, and I do not believe that the future is completely fixed. But I think there's other reasons that people don't do predictive readings. That's probably another video. I have thoughts about that. But, a lot of, I think, the kinds of questions that I ask tarot for myself are not really verifiable questions. I can't really test whether my reading was true or false. I might be able to assess later on whether it was useful, whether it was a reading that I've made good use of by kind of actioning the knowledge that I got from that reading in one way or another. But the idea of verification, for a lot of the kinds of questions that I ask, if I'm asking questions around, processing something difficult, or some self-care or affirmation, or just kind of checking in with kind of my energetic inner landscape. These don't seem to be kind of verifiable in the sense that epistemologists often talk about. So I think it's an interesting question, is to what extent can we think about different kinds of tarot readings as having been accurate or inaccurate? When I do think those of us who love tarot, who read tarot, who get tarot readings, many or most or all of us probably have some sense that tarot works, right? I mean, we certainly don't all have the same idea of why it works, but certainly if you spent 30 whole minutes with me talking about this, and you're interested in tarot to that extent, you probably have some sense that tarot works, right? The tarot does something that matters. And I think that these epistemological questions are an interesting way to explore what that is. So I hope that this has been interesting anyway. I do enjoy rambling about these kinds of questions and, thinking through ideas like this. So I've enjoyed sharing my thoughts. Let me know any thoughts you might have or feedback you might have in the comment section or questions, and I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you a wonderful day.